Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode is titled, The Bear Who Stalked and Killed Harley Piper. The date was November 4th, 1988. It was a cold, blustery day, and Harley Piper and his hunting party were heading up to hunt deer on the south end of Baranof Island off the coast of Alaska, near Port Alexander. This part of Alaska is essentially a temperate rainforest with abundant moisture, cool temperatures, and lots of thick vegetation. The deer hunting is great, and the target is Sitka black-tailed deer, which is a diminutive version of the same black-tailed deer found in the western United States and Canada. Baranof Island is a mountainous, unforgiving environment and features some world-class scenery and lots of bears. The bears here subsist off of deer and various plants and berries when seasonally available. During the salmon runs, the bears feast off of the skin and eggs of the females to build the fat they will need to survive hibernation. The hunting party included David Trejo from Juneau and James Hendricks from Port Alexander, both in their 30s, and Harley, who was 40 years old. Each of the men were in healthy shape and ready to hit the bush for a great time pursuing their favorite target. The three men agreed to go in different directions and ironed out the usual safety signals and plans. Harley decided to walk down the beach as a way to put distance between him and his partners. He then walked a couple of 100 yards into the bush until he located a patch of muskeg, which is a swampy area that grass grows in and is great for watching for moving animals. He found a spruce tree for cover and sat down to use his deer call. His equipment was in his pockets, and he fumbled around looking for various items he was planning on using during his hunt. As Harley called, his head surveyed the bush around the muskeg, carefully watching for deer to bust out of cover and check out what was going on. The safety of his rifle was on, and he removed his scope cover so he could quickly zoom in on anything that drew his attention. He was enjoying his time in the peaceful surroundings. Suddenly, an eruption of growling and grunting surrounded Harley. He turned around to see a huge male brown bear closing in on him quickly from only 30 yards. The bear's back paws were digging into the soil as it put all of its energy into pursuing its prey. The bear was unavoidable to Harley now, as he had only a fraction of a second to react before the bear's impact sent him spilling onto his back. Harley's eyeglasses and cap were sent sailing through the air, and his rifle was driven halfway into the muskeg. The bear immediately broke Harley's neck and began tearing his body apart. A few hundred yards away, Harley's hunting buddies heard Harley scream and the bear growl. They immediately hurried to the location. They arrived at the attack scene, and Harley was gone. Only a scattered spread of his possessions and pools of his blood remained. The two men immediately left the area to gather help to find their friend. A small search party from nearby Sitka had arrived on scene and were milling around when search and rescue expert Don Cluting, who was trained in tracking and was an EMT, arrived on the scene. From the attack scene, the search party followed a drag trail left by the bear as it hauled Harley off. The drag trail was littered with torn clothing, tissue, and bone fragments, and was covered with blood. The bear dragged Harley parallel to the beach for half a mile, and the armed search party followed the trail warily. The trail continued for a while before the party, which included Harley's hunting buddies, reached a particularly gory and bloody point. Harley's hunting buddies were visibly shaken by the scene and decided to turn back. They were overwhelmed by the day's events. Roland Young, who was an Alaska State Trooper, took command of 6 of the men, and Don led the other 6 men, and they took the lead to follow the trail. Roland's group would document evidence as it was discovered and mark its location, as the other party would search for the next. The search party continued in this manner until they could only find the drag trail. No more blood, bone fragments, or tattered clothes. Suddenly a deep growl rumbled across the forest, very near to the search party members. Don immediately instructed 3 of his men to stay on the nearby ridge, as the other 3 slowly crept uphill about 20 yards. Two of the men lost their nerve and lagged behind cautiously, while Don continued on another few yards, when suddenly he spotted the bear's giant head in the bush. The same moment he spotted the bear, the angry Bruin quickly charged the three men left on the ridge. There was only 70 yards between the enraged bear as it initiated its charge and the men. The brush whipped and tossed as the bear steamrolled anything in its path. It was moving so quickly that Don could only process a brown blur as it flashed through the undergrowth. Don and another search party member both fired a shot at the bear, but despite being vitally wounded, it didn't even slow down. The two men feverishly worked the actions on their rifles, while the bear closed to within 20 yards of the men on the ridge. Don and his partner each fired another shot, and that diverted the bear's anger towards them. The bear's eyes were burning with rage, and it was coming to kill Don and his friend. Fortunately, the last two shots struck the bear's shoulders, and as it turned toward the pair, it collapsed and rolled onto its back. Don took 11 steps and was alongside the fierce giant, and humanely fired a shot into its skull for insurance. The men who were standing on the ridge were a mere 2 steps from where the bear fell. The charge had caused such chaos amongst the men on the ridge that one of them tripped and dangled over a 20-foot cliff. Another had stepped into a hole up to his hips and was firing into the air, but managed to shoot the bear in the foot. The third man's rifle had misfired, with a round lodged in the chamber. Don radioed back to Roland to let him know it was over and the bear was dead. The party proceeded to the location where the bear had initially growled at them. They found Harley's partially consumed body buried under a bunch of duff piled up by the bear. The bear had apparently been laying on Harley's remains when the search party walked upon the scene. They collected Harley's remains into a recovery bag to bring him back to his family. Don skinned the bear as part of his investigation and noted that the very healthy male had nearly 0 body fat with a very thick hide. The bear's pelt was nearly 10 feet square when laid out on the ground, which is a giant bear. The unprovoked attack is a rare event, but it is believed the bear's predatory instinct was triggered after hearing the deer call Harley was using. After that, Harley was simply a food source. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes place on Raspberry Island, which is an island just north of Kodiak Island in Alaska. Raspberry Island is a rolling hill country covered with brush and grass. The streams are filled with salmon seasonally, and the hills with berries. The perfect environment for bears, very large bears. It was a cold, blustery day in November 1999. Gene Moe was hunting deer on Raspberry Island, a very remote and primitive location. Gene knew well that when it snowed, like other areas, deer on Raspberry Island would be pushed to lower elevations to find browse and shelter. The location is a mountainous wilderness filled with hazards and excitement, just the way the 69-year-old liked it. He spent many a season in the backwoods, enjoying solitude and peace. This year was possibly the last time he would enjoy this environment. He was going to make the most of it. After a few days of hunting together, he and his hunting partner Steve decided to split up to cover different areas and mitigate their different perspectives and strategies. Gene told Steve that if he heard a shot to come and assist, just to make sure everything was okay. Even though the hunting partners were only a few hundred yards apart, Gene managed to call in a Sitka blacktail, the predominant deer species of the area. As twilight was creeping in, Gene leaned over his buck and started to process his harvest. He used his 4-inch buck knife to gut the deer and started to remove the hide from the carcass. Gene leaned his rifle up against a tree nearby while he worked. In a chaotic explosion of swaying bushes and growling, an extremely large brown bear emerged from the brush a very short distance away. The Bruin was foaming at the mouth and spitting. and growling through razor-sharp yellow teeth. Armed with only his knife, Gene readied himself for a life-or-death confrontation. He knew if he ran, he would trigger the bear's predatory instincts and be overcome from behind, the most vulnerable direction. He stared the hungry bear in the eyes and conveyed a devotion and commitment met by the bear's. The ears of the bear lowered, and its head dropped in the final signal of commitment. The bear surged forward toward Gene. He had no previous experience to fall back on, so he decided to extend the only defensive weapon he had, his skinning knife. He held the blade out straight toward the charging bear and placed his feet far apart to brace for impact. Gene was 6 feet 1 inch tall and in great shape. He worked out regularly for hunting and fishing seasons. You see, Gene was a product of the Great Depression, and those folks did not shrink from hardship nor threat. Years of finishing concrete had honed his physique and resolve. As the giant bear closed the 30 feet that separated the pair, Gene prayed out loud, saying, "Lord, I need your help. Help me, Lord." The bear didn't hesitate as it drew on years of instinct. As the bear blurred toward Gene, the edge of the knife held forward didn't strike the bear's mouth, as Gene had intended, but skimmed along the bruin's cheek and sliced open a gash along the length of its skull. The now injured and angered bear clamped down on Gene's right arm, around his bicep, tearing the muscle and flesh from just above his elbow all the way down to his wrist. From the pain of the initiation of the attack, Gene thought his arm was completely torn off. The direction and force of the bear's focus caused Gene to turn towards the bear, and he instinctively wrapped his left arm around the neck of the giant predator. Gene tried to poke the bear in the eye. Instead, he managed to get his first finger into its ear and pushed it in as far as he could. The bear reacted with confusion and pulled back. With his arm still around its neck, the bear suplexed Gene like a professional wrestler. Amazed at the ease of which the bear just launched him about 10 feet, Gene sprang back to his feet. The bear, now only about 5 yards away, took a few seconds to review the situation. It stood on its hind legs and walked towards its adversary. Like a wary boxer, Gene watched the bear's right paw, knowing most are like humans and prefer their right side. Gene circled to his left as the bear struck out with its right paw. Even though Gene pulled his head back, one of the bear's claws bisected his left ear. The bear immediately followed up with a quick swipe from its left paw, which landed on Gene's right leg and knocked him to the ground. The claws from the bear tore up his leg and parted skin, muscle, and tendon. As the bear closed in, Gene put his boots together and double-kicked the bear just under the chin, sending it backward, knocking it down. Gene beat the bear back to his feet. By this point in the brawl, Gene had recognized that the death battle had an informally defined arena. The bear circled to Gene's left, and he knew from experience the bruin would use its left paw to attack. Gene slipped inside of it and was pressed into the bear's chest. The bear twisted its head to catch Gene's right knee and clamped down. Instinctively, Gene tried to gain leverage and wrapped his arm around the bear's neck, but the bear was too strong. Gene swung his blade up to just below the bear's jaw and plunged it in repeatedly. He dug the blade in as far as he could, and the bear pulled back in resistance. The bear's right paw wrapped around Gene's left buttock, and he lifted the man off the ground to attempt another pro wrestler-style slam. Without the added power of its right leg, the bear couldn't complete the motion and had to release its grip on the man. As the bear did this, Gene took his blade, and with as much energy as he could muster, he plunged the short blade into the flesh just behind the bear's massive head. This strike hit something hard, and the bear retreated a short distance, with its head cocked to one side and spraying blood all over Gene. The bear seemed to shrink as it gushed blood. Gene yelled, "Come on, bear, the Lord is on my side." And with that challenge, the 750-pound Bruin leapt the 6-foot distance toward Gene. In a last-ditch effort, Gene swung his left fist with all the fury a man fighting for his life could muster, striking the bear just below the right eye. The bear quivered for a split second and bounced off the ground in a heap. The way the bear collapsed with its feet and head under its body, Gene knew the bear was dead. With his knife still clasped in his right hand and his left hand still clenched in a fist, Gene knew he would ensure his victory with a resounding blast from his rifle. He had to open his right fist with his teeth and his now numb left hand to grasp his rifle. Pushing the dangling flesh of his right arm back into position, Gene fired 2 shots to ensure the end of the struggle. Gene then realized the first part of his struggle had ended, and he needed to get back to the beach to survive. He pushed his way through the dense alders for about 2 miles as branches pulled at his mutilated right arm. He was exhausted, thirsty, and decided to lay down to die. He prayed to God to take him from his condition. He fell and got back up 3 times before finally reaching the beach. Gene was too far gone to continue and mustered a loud yell to his hunting partners, and they responded. Approaching him, they witnessed his clothes torn to tatters and his body ripped up beyond hope. Gene begged his friends to shoot him and end his misery. The trio rounded up Gene's son and sped toward the nearest radio in 40 miles. Gene's son tore fabric strips into impromptu bandages as the group rendered their best version of first aid. The U.S. Coast Guard was notified and happened to be completing exercises in the area. They immediately flew toward the remote location to help. The doctor at Kodiak's new hospital worked on Gene for 7 hours, sewing up his wounds. A group of Gene's friends and volunteers decided to head up to the attack scene, following Gene's blood trail. They located his rifle and found the dead bear. It was a 13-year-old sow who had chased off her 2 cubs just a short time earlier to fatten up for the winter. She attacked him out of hunger because that year the salmon had not run.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the remote and nearly untouched Glacier Bay National Park and Reserve with its iconic glaciers and fjords. The park is located in southeast Alaska along the coast and presents some of the most beautiful scenery on Earth. The forests are lush and green with giant pines and all kinds of berry bushes. The bay itself lies to the east of where our events that we are discussing today occurred. This area is remote and rugged. Help is not close, nor is it fast in response. Most people who travel to this area understand that if they get into trouble, they're on their own. On September 10th of 1976, 25-year-old Alan Precup arranged for his backpacking trip into the preserve through the visitor's office. He was up from Illinois and had quickly embraced the Alaskan lifestyle and experience. He established his travel route and timeline so they would know where he was planning on visiting and when he would be back. When September 13th rolled around, Mr. Precup did not meet officials at his pickup time and location. A search party was immediately launched to find him. On September 16th, a party including Charles Jackson, Leilani Vega, Peter Talbot, and Colin Milmer were hiking into the White Thunder Ridge area just above Muir Inlet. The group had been briefed on Mr. Precup and had agreed to keep an eye out for him. They were only planning on staying a single night and being picked up on the 17th, but it made them a little more comfortable to know that there were search crews in the area. The group began setting up their camp to prepare their soup lunch and hot chocolate. The fresh air rejuvenated them as they embraced their short-lived experience to the fullest. It was a little after 11:30 a.m. when Mr. Talbot noticed a brown dot approaching in the distance along the lake. It could be a caribou, or maybe a moose. It didn't look big enough to be a moose, though. Slowly the brown dot approached, and the friends discerned it was a smallish brown bear. The group decided to take some proactive measures to make sure this bear knew they were there and were not prey. They grabbed pots and pans and anything else and clanged it together and yelled to frighten the bear. Each time they did this, the bear would stop and look around, seemingly confused, but then would continue heading toward them after a few seconds. The party now decided that the safest thing they could do is to pack up their food items and head over to a shelf of cliffs in a respectful attempt to get out of the bear's intended travel route. He would probably just walk right past them and go be a bear somewhere else. They labored to the cliff tops and found trees to cache their food in. As they looked down upon their camp, they could see the bear trashing their tents and biting anything he could find with human scent. Then the bear dropped its nose, like a bloodhound, onto the group's trail. The bear sniffed along the exact path they used to get to the safety of the cliffs. They immediately decided they needed to make more space between them and the bear, so they headed further away from camp along the cliff. They looked back at their food stash, expecting to see the bear pulling in their food bags, but the bear kept his nose to the ground and followed their trail. He wasn't interested in the food cache, just the people. They half ran, half walked the steep cliffs surrounding the lake and arrived back at their camp at 1:15. The bear had followed their scent trail the entire time. The group decided to seek protection on the hill above their camp and began hiking in that direction. The bear followed them, now a mere 20 feet behind. They'd removed jackets and ponchos and anything else to cool themselves, as the exertion from the pursuit made them sweat. At the top of the hill there was a large swale that separated the bear from the campers, only about 10 feet apart. The danger and fright of the situation had well set in with the group, and they decided they must defend themselves. They had very few weapons of any use in defense, so they armed themselves with rocks and began pelting the bear. Seemingly confused from the yelling and chaos, the bear walked a short distance away and laid down, putting his head on his paws. It observed every movement anyone in the group made. A bush plane flew over during the incident on the top of the hill. It circled around 5 times or so, and the group felt confident they'd been seen. They expected the pilot to buzz the bear and run him off, but they were wrong. They'd not been seen by the pilot, and their predicament was unnoted by anyone. They decided that they would use the cover of the plane to go down the hill to some other campers in the area. They quickly dropped down the hill and discussed the bizarre situation with their new friends. The now larger group looked on as they watched the bear crest the hill and carefully sniff out each of the human tracks. Now looked like a great time to beat feet back to the Forest Service boat, which they safely arrived at about 3:30 in the afternoon. The rangers listened with concern and alarm as they described the bear's behavior. The authorities immediately dispatched Park Ranger James Luthi to investigate by helicopter. Luthi's ranger crew flew over a destroyed camp and radioed down to hiking rangers to investigate. Luthi prepped himself to be lowered from the helicopter to look over things himself as well. Luthi witnessed many of Precup's possessions with bite marks and damage from the bear, but couldn't locate Alan. He reboarded the copter and they left, while they waited for the rangers on foot to get to the scene. The bear basically bit into everything that had human scent. The rangers encountered the bear near the camp and pelted it with rocks and eventually drove it off. After searching the area, they located the grim remains of Alan Precup. The bear had efficiently picked Alan's bones clean in the few days since the attack. His clothes lay beside his skeletal remains, and his ribs were strewn about the vicinity. His arms were torn or chewed from his body, and his skull was completely defleshed and set where his neck would be. His nearly intact scalp lay nearby, and his right hand lay beneath a page of a book apart from its arm. His feet were still in his socks and boots. Alan's remains were removed from the area and returned to his family for burial. There was no conclusive link made, but authorities are sure the bear that ate Alan was also the bear that chased the Jackson group around the lake. I could find no record of what became of the bear and assumed that it had escaped after confronting the rangers. Authorities determined there was an abundance of berries and salmon in the area that year, and Alan Precup's attack was solely predatory.